All right, so just to let everybody know, I've set this to be recorded. Will be posted as well on our YouTube channel, which is fastly filling up with wonderful presentations, including by some folks here. Just going to wait a couple more minutes, let people trickle in.
I'm assuming I can share my screen.
Yeah, I'll make you a co-host just in case. Okay. All right, everyone. So welcome. Welcome a lot to our regularly scheduled Blue Box seminar. Before we begin, I would like to acknowledge that the territory in which many of us are gathering here, but not Barb, who's in Ontario, is the ancestral homelands of the Beothuk, and the Newfoundland Island as the ancestral homelands of the Beothuk and the Mi'kmaq. I would also like to recognize the Inuit of Nunatsiavut and Inutuhavut, as well as the Innu of Desinan and their ancestors as the original peoples of Labrador. We strive for respectful relationships with all peoples on this land as we search for collective healing and true reconciliation, and ultimately honor this beautiful land and its wonderful water together. So today, we have a speaker that's going to continue the talks that we've been having about climate change, both yesterday and also the week before. Her name is Dr. Barbara Jane Davy. Dr. Davy studies unconscious motivations, conscience, and value formation, and how ritual functions as part of complex adaptive systems. She is a scholar practitioner and holds a PhD in religion from Concordia University, as well as a second PhD in social and ecological sustainability from the University of Waterloo. Dr. Davy is a dear friend, a wonderful colleague, and I'm just so glad to turn the floor over to you now.
Thanks. So I'm going to share my screen. Actually, I need to do, never mind, I need to share the screen first and then start the presentation. Sorry about that. You'd think I'd have this down by now, but apparently not. Okay, there we go. So the title of my talk is Hallow the Dead to Fight Climate Change. So I'm going to start out by talking a little bit about the meaning of hallow. Halloween is coming up in a couple of days, and it's the same root word. Hallow means to praise, to venerate, to honor. So this is timely this time of year around Halloween, which is the eve of All Hallows, the Day of the Dead, when some people welcome the dead and give them offerings. So what does that have to do with climate change? Well, ancestor veneration has some unexpected consequences. Giving thanks, as people often do when they're making offerings, expressing gratitude matters. So I start off by saying thanks to Evan for giving me the opportunity to give this seminar and for seeing value in my work. And I also want to start off with a land acknowledgement to say thanks to the air, the land, and its people. I recently moved back to Ottawa, and I really love this place. And I want to recognize the original inhabitants, the ancestors of this place, the Anishinaabe people. I live on unceded territory of the Algonquins. Land acknowledgements can be an empty ritual, just saying words, but they can also be a beginning to living in a storied world, a living landscape. So it might feel awkward to express gratitude and include land acknowledgements in talks like this, but I'm happy to see that they're more often being included, because giving thanks has psychological effects, especially when we do it in a social context. So I like to ask people, who are you grateful for, particularly who is present? I don't know if you have the capacity to unmute yourself and share, but if you're comfortable and if it is possible, you can say who you're thankful for or grateful for, who is present right now.
I'm thankful for you coming, as well as some of my students and my good friend Sandra Eager, who's also here today, and
Awesome.
colleagues in the department.
Can you hear me?
Yes.
I'm thankful for all of y'all and the generosity which scientists and social scientists give to their work, and I've definitely seen that in Evan, and I thank him for showing me what passion looks like. Thank you, Evan.
That's lovely. So why do I encourage people to do this kind of thing? Why is it important? Well, because we're all going to die. Hopefully not right now, but thinking about that also has psychological effects. It often makes us think or makes us feel scared, hopeless, when we think about these kinds of scary images of climate change. It makes people feel demoralized, apathetic, or environmentalists. It often can bring up fear and anger, or like you talked about at the end of your last talk that Evan organized, that touched on uncertainty and fear. What's scarier than climate change? Well, maybe COVID, maybe zombies. Oops, I missed my zombie slide. There we go. Environmental doom and gloom can be scary, and these apocalyptic narratives have measurable psychological effects. They're often not as useful as we might think they are. This particular one can be seen as pro-environmental. It's a picture from George Romero's 1978 film, Dawn of the Dead, which actually has a fairly strong anti-consumerist message. It presents zombies as compelled to consume and congregating in the mall, which is sort of a commentary on what we actually do on a regular basis. But what happens more often when we talk about climate change? When we're reminded of the possible collapse of modern civilization, this presents an existential threat. It often leads to disengagement when we talk about the possibility of societal collapse. It leads to a lot of resistance. But what is the rational response that academics usually offer for this? And how adequate is it? If only we used our brains instead of acting like zombies, we'd fix climate change. But is it that simple? It's a rational assumption, right? If we have the data, which we do, we have lots of good scientific understanding of the problem of climate change. And we have lots of public education. So people should be able to come to an agreement and implement a solution. This is what reality congruent models are supposed to do to help us create better interventions. This is sometimes referred to as the knowledge deficit hypothesis or information deficit model. It supposes that if we don't have action, we must be missing something in the knowledge transfer. This is why we have lots of funding available for things like knowledge mobilization. But this doesn't seem to describe what actually happens with big environmental problems such as climate change. You might be familiar with this kind of sentiment expressed online lately. We have lots of data on climate change. There's no lack of information. There's lots of education. There's lots of knowledge transfer going on. It's not a lack of information. And in fact, we know from doing social science research that the more you present people with information about things like climate change or vaccine hesitancy, things like this, it just makes people more sure that they're right. It doesn't actually change their minds. So environmentalists tend to keep saying the same things louder. Well, it's not really having an effect. So why do we keep trying to appeal to reason? when it's not working and people are actively resisting thinking about it, what's going on? I think a large part of this is, in fact, mortality salience. These kinds of narratives remind us of the fact that we're going to die. It presents what terror management theorists call a death prime. This is something, an image or a statement or something that makes people reminded of the fact that they're going to die. So this is an important side effect of being able to think about the future at all, is this awareness of mortality. We can envision the future, and we can envision a future when we're not here. This creates existential anxiety. And this angst has social psychological effects. We know from terror management theory that what happens when people are presented with the information that they're going to die, what happens is we raise up our worldview as a defense against this awareness. It functions as an unconscious defense. We raise it as a shield unconsciously against thinking about the fact that we're going to die. This is part of that social psychology branch of study called terror management theory. They've done more than 500 empirical studies now of what happens when you remind people of the fact that they're going to die. And consistently, people want to defend their values when they feel threatened, because we psychologically equate this with defense of the group in which our self-worth is vested. Our identity is built through socialization and a sense of group belonging. This is where we have a sense of our core values that we defend when we feel threatened. Defending our values is like defending the group that we feel part of, defending our own identity. So in the modern world, typically awareness of death makes us want to go out and buy more stuff. It prompts a desire to consume. There are lots of studies in terror management theory that find that this is what happens. This is because our unconsciously held worldview is consumerist. This is constantly reinforced through advertising and ubiquitous economic metaphors. Survival has become equated with having a job and money to buy things. So in the affluent world, this is an environmental problem. It leads to overconsumption. And when environmental discourses use apocalyptic narratives, scary images of climate change, this compounds the effects. And we know specifically now from terror management theory studies that in the affluent world, in the modern world, if you talk about climate change, people do in fact want to go out and buy more stuff. It's counterproductive. So you might think, well, my worldview isn't consumerist, I'm a scientist. So my worldview is scientific. But this is, in fact, only the rational part of our worldviews. The more important part governing our core values and much of our behavior is not rational. This more basic part of our worldview is fundamentally consumerist in modern society. So our consciously held worldview and value systems are likely to be pro-environmental, pro-science, rationally coherent, while our unconsciously held worldview is consumerist, putting the economy and unconscious desires of our individualized selves before all else. There are some studies now in terror management theory that have found that other values can be brought to mind in conjunction with raising mortality salience or death awareness that will operationalize those other values. We can get people to express alternative values if we bring them to mind and they are shared values in the group of people. So this is something that has been tested empirically, as I say. I don't do that kind of research. I have not done that kind of empirical studies, but I have done qualitative research looking at what kinds of values are brought up in ritual practices. And I've noticed a lot of death primes or mortality salience also arising in some of these rituals. One example is offerings given to ancestors. There's evidence from my work that giving thanks to ancestors and to what we might call spirits of nature increases people's sense of gratitude. ritual practices of giving offerings, expressing thanks, such are evident in the people that I study, which are heathen communities. These tend to inspire a desire to give in turn. So for those of you who don't know, heathenry is a form of contemporary paganism. Heathens revive pre-Christian traditions of Northern Europe, so Germanic, Norse, Baltic, Frankish, early English traditions. I've recently completed a 2-year ethnographic study on contemporary heathens in Ontario at 2 research sites in particular. One is Ravens Knoll, which is a private campground in Eastern Ontario, where a lot of pagan festivals are held in the summer, as well as Vindasir Kindred, which is a small group of heathens based in Southwestern Ontario. And I am in fact part of these communities. So I did participant observation and interviews. And what I found was that there is mortality salience present in these practices of giving offerings to ancestors. This particular example in the photo is from a yearly ritual held by Vindasir Kindred, where offerings are given to female ancestors in particular. So giving offerings to ancestors in general is going to make mortality salient. Of course, it's explicitly present there. As you can see, there's a human skeleton at the table. And people, while they do this, they are expressing thanks to their ancestors. And in this particular group, that includes not just biological ancestors, but also ancestors of affinity. This is a term from Daniel Foor's work, a book called Ancestral Medicine. He talks about how ancestors do not just include our genetic relations, but also cultural ancestors, people who inspire us, who have given into the community that we want to recognize in events like this where we're venerating ancestors. In this particular group of heathens, I see an alternative worldview to the modern worldview where practitioners blur a line between ancestors and what we might call land spirits. There's a more relational understanding of the self, less individualized, more of a distributed sense of self in community and relatedness with other species, and also a sense of the community extending into the past through ancestors and into the future through descendants. So I find that ancestor veneration encourages a sense of the longue durée, a long time span of history, and a sense of obligations to descendants. If you think about it, if you're grateful to your ancestors, what is the way to pass on what you are grateful for receiving? It's to do it through your descendants or through future generations. This is something that philosophy has struggled to come up with a rational justification for why it makes sense to have duties to future obligations. It's something that actually just happens as a matter of course if you practice ancestor veneration. So we also have in this community a sense of recognition of ancestors of place. These are imagined ancestors of a far distant past. This is recalled at Ravens Knoll, that festival site in Eastern Ontario, where pagans have erected a standing stone where they make offerings to ancestors. Sometimes it's called the ancestor stone. And you can see it's marked with red handprints. These are made with red ochre. So it's done as an intentional echo of various practices from the long distant human past, where we have these early markings that survive in various parts of the world, in Europe and in North America, of petroglyphs, where people have marked rocks with red ochre. This particular one is made with a lintel or a threshold from an early dwelling that people found on the land and set up to use specifically in this way. And it's intentionally done to create a connection with deep time and a sense of shared history and a kinship with all peoples. And at Ravens Knoll, people do sometimes make offerings as part of land acknowledgements at this particular place. These kinds of practices of making offerings and having an overlap between a sense of who are ancestors of place, who are ancestors of affinity, it helps re-enchant people's relationship with the world. And this has been explained to me explicitly by other heathens in the community. When people have been dead long enough that their names have been forgotten, yet people still bring offerings to their burial site, which is something that's common in past traditions in Europe that inspire contemporary heathens. They become part of the collective ancestors. The heathens in North America call them Basir for female ancestors, or Alfar for ancestors in general, or sometimes male ancestors. In Europe, people kept giving offerings in outbuildings and on old burial mounds, and eventually came to see the recipients of those offerings as not human anymore, as things like gnomes. Like in the picture, you see a tiny little garden gnome. Or in Denmark, they'll call them Nis, in Iceland, Huldefolk, in Sweden, Alfar, or in English, elves. This sets up a continuity between ancestors and what heathens call landvitir, or powers of the land. This is something you could translate as genius loci, which is the Latin term, or spirits of the land. I don't tend to like to use that term spirit because it suggests some sort of incorporeal thing, when I think more often people are referring to something in the land itself, living things, rocks, trees, bodies of water, this sort of thing. So I think this supports an enchanted view, a storied landscape that sets up a wider imagined community, which can help extend moral community. Ritual can be an effective means of motivating environmental action and care for others through developing a more inclusive sense of moral community, not just restricted to the human community. Of course, ritual can set up a more exclusive narrative of who is part of the community. This is something that we actually see in some segments of the heathen population, which unfortunately are quite racist. And they do set up a sense of who is part of the community on the basis of skin color, which inclusive heathens like me think is ridiculous and abhorrent. But it can also lead to a more expanded sense of moral community. When we venerate the dead, it makes obligations of them come to mind, and they become part of our moral community. And it prompts people to give in turn to the next generation. In some healing communities, this includes dead pets. That helps extend the border of who is part of the community beyond the human. But what we celebrate when we are making offerings to our ancestors matters. It matters what values we bring to mind. As I said, whether those values are inclusive, like inclusive heathens, or whether it's exclusive, whether people include anything beyond their biological ancestors, to also include, as I say, ancestors of affinity or cultural ancestors, imagined ancestors. If we do open up that broader sense of who is an ancestor, then we can live in a more inclusive moral community. And we can recognize ancestors of place, not just ancestors who are biological relations to us. I think this does help us live in a more storied landscape. It gives us a sense of relatedness to a wider, more than human world. It can re-enchant the world. As I say, it gives a sense of obligations beyond the human. When we give gifts, when we give offerings to non-human others, it helps us feel that we are in moral relations of reciprocity between humans and the rest of the world. So heathens, I think, do have this sense of imagined community that includes a more than human world. And if you're familiar with Indigenous perspectives, you might see some connections there. So what does this mean for pro-environmental strategies? Well, I think we should be focusing on raising shared values. I think too often we focus on raising awareness of the problem, but that shouldn't be our goal. This picture of people from Netflix's Santa Clara Diet, this is another zombie thing. And I put this in here because in the second season of that show, the daughter of this zombie mom, Sheila, participates in an environmental demonstration. So it actually raises pro-environmental sentiment from Liv's participation in this anti-fracking protest. And it makes environmentalism salient as part of a narrative which also raises mortality salience. But participating in protest as an aim in itself isn't always effective. It matters what values are brought to mind in these actions and campaigns. And we also need to consider what are the priming effects that are taking place in these kinds of events and in our communications about climate change. If we're going to include death primes, if we're going to make mortality salient when we are communicating about climate change, we need to do that with care. We need to make sure we raise relevant values, because otherwise our behavior is just going to default to consumerism, and often in modern society, xenophobia. People are motivated to act to protect their own when death is brought to mind. Another important priming effect, which I didn't want to put up on the screen, but I'll talk about briefly, is money. Economic metaphors. This primes selfishness in modern society. And economic metaphors are ubiquitous. They're everywhere, and they support consumerism. An example that might be familiar to some people of a priming sort of effect is using smiley faces. This is something that can prompt renewed efforts to improve. It's been used in metering campaigns. Normally, you might expect, it's a rational expectation, if you meter people's energy consumption, their water consumption, if you show them numbers of doing better, this can motivate them to conserve. But what happens is if people see how much they're consuming and they notice that they are doing better than average, that demotivates them. But that can be countered by just putting a smiley face beside the numbers. And people, again, want to do better. Another one I've seen as a priming effect in my work is the watchful eye prime. Eyes, even just a triangle of 3 dots arranged like eyes and a nose. This promotes pro-social behavior. This is something you can see anytime there's a skull present, or on lots of ritual masks, things like this. There'll be this kind of priming effect in place. Sometimes priming effects can be culturally specific, and of course, what values are shared in the group of people matters quite a bit. You can't just randomly insert a value with a death prime and expect people to act on it. It has to be a value that they perceive as part of their identity, a value that is shared. You have to draw on familiar meanings, metaphors, associations that make sense within the group of people that you're communicating with. So if you don't want people to smash your pumpkins, put a face on it with a nose to make them unconsciously act if they're being watched. But also be aware that if people who are inclined to smash pumpkins are out with their friends and those friends are sharing antisocial values when they're reminded of death, well, maybe that's not going to go so well. In my work, I make the assumption that we need to reduce consumption amongst the affluent to deal with climate change. The kinds of things that I'm suggesting here often are indirect approaches of encouraging an inclusive sense of self, a sense of obligation to a wider community and to future generations, to a larger imagined community that includes the more than human world. Things like gifting practices, making offerings and expressing gratitude, these prompt reciprocity and community mindedness, and maybe a sense of having enough, which could reduce the desire to consume. But there are also lessons to be learned from looking at ritual practices for secular communications to see what kinds of priming effects are in place and how we might draw more generally, more frequently on shared values when we're trying to motivate people to particular actions. That's it.
Wow. Thank you so much, Barb. Everybody is clapping. It's fantastic. Anybody have any questions? I have one to get us going, to get us chatting. Is what you talked a little bit about fear. What's the role of hope in this research?
That's not so much something that I have focused on in my own research. I know that is something that other people have been talking about in terms of climate change discourse. Sometimes people will talk about, well, we need a shared narrative that can counter these sort of negative messages, or talking about a need for a shared cultural sense of values in general. But I'm not convinced we do actually need to all share the same perspective, or do we need to get unity on these things? Because I think people can be motivated to support the same values through different communities that express things in quite different ways. Like, for instance, lots of different religious communities. There are lots of religious groups that are participating in efforts to do something about climate change. And they don't have to agree on any kind of a shared cultural narrative in a theological sense to still have the same values.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. What about scaling up? You talked about indirect and primes. What are some options for scaling some of this up and perhaps being a bit more direct about it?
Well, I think we need to more often recognize these unconscious effects, because often there's this assumption that we just need to communicate the facts, but the facts themselves don't motivate action. We actually do need to share values at the same time in order to get people to act on those shared values.
Mm-hmm. Anybody else have a question? Lillian?
Thank you for your presentation. It was really, really enlightening, and I'm very fascinated by the idea of like making people feel safe rather than triggered, as a because like that just makes so much sense to me. And I'm also wondering if you could share some of the like what the shared values to like some suggestions as to what shared values we can bring up. I'm not sure if you mentioned those, but maybe
I didn't really give examples, but in some of my other work, I do draw on other people's research about what are effective ways to reach different audiences, like climate change deniers in particular, to talk about controlling emissions and talk about climate change or global warming. Those are non-starters, particularly in the United States with climate change deniers. So one thing that you can use to motivate people who express those kinds of views or share that kind of perspective is to talk about clean air instead. Clean air is something that everybody wants, and just structuring communications around that is a much more productive way to communicate with people, to not even mention climate change at all, because at this point it just turns people off. So there's research that was done by the Pew Research Center in the United States, which some people have connected specifically to climate change communication to talk about the 6 Americas for different ways of engaging with different sectors of the population in order to communicate more effectively. So I don't recall offhand, but you can look up an article of mine that's linked from, I wrote a piece that came out a little while ago in The Conversation. And there's some information there, as well as that article cites an academic article of mine, which has even more of that stuff you can draw on.
Yeah. As a follow-up question, I'm wondering, like, this sense of generosity, I'm wondering how you kind of compare that. So, like, a lot of times I've noticed that even though I have plenty, I feel like a sense of scarcity. I'm wondering, do you think that's like, do you think that's kind of manipulated by the consumerist messages?
For
'Cause
sure.
I never thought about it like that. I was like, why do I feel like I never have enough?
Yeah, it's because in order to keep our economy going, we have to consume more. It's structured that way because we overproduce things now. We produce far more things than we need. So marketing drives us to buy far more things than we need. Marketing is extremely manipulative in trying to undermine people's self-esteem so that they will feel like they don't have enough, they are not enough. So I think an effective way to counter this is to more often talk about what it is that we are grateful for, because if you do express that more frequently, it gives you a sense of, actually, I have a lot of cool things. I have a lot going on for me. And I find this interesting in the healing community that I'm part of in terms of ancestor veneration. When people think about, well, a few hundred years ago, what were my ancestors doing and what did they need to do to survive? If you think about like having to spin all your own wool in order to make clothing to be warm enough for the winter, that makes me grateful for central heating, for having hot water, central plumbing, things like this. Just bringing those things to mind more often, I think, makes us feel more gratitude, and it makes us feel less of a need to consume.
Great questions, Lil. Are there any other questions that folks have or observations? I wondered if you might comment a bit on the space for this kind of science and professional practice in the world today, in universities in the world today. How much space is there, do you think, for this, given its this kind of research, given its important role in communicating one of the most important global trends in the world?
Well, I can speak to my own experience in terms of I applied to do a postdoc further looking at these kinds of questions. And even though my application was very highly rated in terms of my qualifications to do the research itself was not regarded as being important. I think that's maybe partly because of it's partly a perception that religion doesn't matter, but it might also be partly a result of just mortality salience in general. You have to be super careful if you're going to talk about things like this to not just make people defensive. So when I talk about stuff like this, it might just inspire people who are very scientifically minded to say that can't matter because it goes against the importance of what I'm doing and my vested sense of self-worth in being a proper scientist, which is kind of counterproductive. I would like to be able to communicate more effectively to say that kind of hard science is absolutely crucial because it tells us what we need to do. It gives us the information that we need. But there's a further step involved in actually changing people's behavior. Like, I often think about, well, we know physically what we need to do to look after our own health. I need to exercise more and I need to eat better. But that knowledge is not the same as actually getting myself to do the things on a regular basis. Those are very different things.
Don't I know it? Okay, we'll do a fine. Yeah, Anatolis.
Yeah. Hi there. Can you hear me? See me? Everything's good? Yeah. So I guess a question that I had, and pardon me if this is half formulated, but when you talk about things like well, giving thanks and like to the ancestors, a lot of the language that you use is often also language that we see being kind of put forward and promoted in indigenous research and indigenous science. I guess my question is, where do you see, especially working with heathen communities, where do you see that your work kind of intersects with kind of these attempts to indigenize the university, as well as potential pitfalls, be it maybe inadvertently appropriating indigenous culture, or pitfalls just being let's say, for the lack of a better word, heathen in academia, which might also not be not always regarded as palatable or salient, as actually I think you just mentioned a moment ago. Thank you.
Yeah, so there's a certain amount of literature that I engage with in my work that does make this connection between contemporary pagans more generally, like heathenry is part of this larger movement, which academics refer to as contemporary paganism. So there is a certain awareness within heathen communities and pagan communities in general of, well, I would say there's a desire and an understanding of people would like to be indigenous, but white people can't do that, right? It's not okay. It's a misappropriation. If I were to try to call myself a shaman or whatever, things like this. So there's lots of engagement of that within pagan communities and also in pagan studies more broadly in academics, where people are looking at this kind of thing happening. And there's quite, I think, a divide between how people talk about this in North America and how they talk about it in Europe, specifically around indigenizing, because in Europe, pagans feel like it's kind of okay to say that you are indigenizing and to use this term taken from Paul C. Johnson's work to talk about trying to make your practices indigenous. Now, there's a fine line there. Like, I don't want to say people are doing things that they shouldn't be, because I think a lot of pagan scholars have been very careful in how they do this. But to talk about that in North America, it wouldn't have occurred to me to look up any of this stuff or engage with it at all, except I had a commentator on an article I have out for peer review right now who said, well, you should be talking about this indigenizing stuff. Well, in North America, you just can't do that. You can't say you're doing something indigenous or you're making it indigenous, because we aren't. And we can't claim that political space to be indigenous. I think this is very clear to us in Canada, particularly right now with all this stuff going on with unresolved issues with finding kids' bodies at residential schools and things like this. Like there's a very different experience of being Indigenous in Canada compared to somebody like me who's got a settler background, who it just would not make any sense to try to equate myself in any way with that. But at the same time, there are these similarities in some of the perspectives that are being developed within heathen religious practices. So in my work, I do relate how heathens think of themselves to the idea of relational ontologies, which has been explored a fair bit in anthropological studies of Indigenous peoples, where there's this sense of having a more relational sense of self as opposed to the highly individualized sense of self that we've developed in modern society. So I do think that heathens have this more relational sort of ontology, at least in an incipient form within contemporary heathen practice. There are similarities, but there's huge political differences between the different communities.
Anatolis, does that address your question? Do you want to do a follow-up?
No, I mean that there's thank you for the answer. There's it's a lot to think about, where, and then and then I mean being aware of, for example, I guess the Norwegian university system, where I've been a part of for the last 3 years. You know, it is, I think, you know, I can see what you're saying, where, you know, the word indigenizing is used a little bit more loosely than it is here. So, I mean, would you propose that we paganize the academia?
I like the term that Robin Wall Kimmerer uses of naturalizing. I think this is a better term for North America in particular, and I think probably also in Norway it would make more sense, just because of the Sami population there, which seems to me to be what we should be calling the indigenous community of Norway rather than Norwegians. But I know that's a controversial topic within Northern Europe.
No, absolutely.
Sorry, go ahead. Continue.
Yeah. No, I mean I think that's a valid point. I mean, yeah, I guess the Sami populations of Europe certainly have seen their fair share of colonialism, as much as the indigenous peoples of North and South America.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, no, thank you.
Thanks for the question.
What about the longue durée of sustainability? I know that you've taught a course on a long view, a very long view.
Yeah.
I don't know if it's a very, very long view. I don't know of sustainability. How does that help us think a little bit more about, you know, environmental issues, opportunities to advance sustainability, particularly related to climate change?
I'm not quite sure how to answer that, because I'm getting distracted by my criticisms of big history when I taught that course. Like it's a course on big history, but I'm not uncritical of the the way that narrative is promoted, because I tend to agree with Lisa Sedaris, who criticizes a lot of these understandings of the implications of a big history perspective for creating pro-environmental behavior. She does a lot of good work to draw out how the values that support the pro-environmental component of that vision are not actually part of the science. There's a religious framing that underlies that has this narrative of evolution towards a greater end, which in fact doesn't ultimately support a sustainable view because it's highly anthropocentric. So that's a little bit more that I can probably get into in a quick addressing of a comment, but I do think having a longer sense of history is useful and it's necessary, because we so often in our political decisions, we're only thinking in terms of like what's in the news and how are we going to spin this for the existing news cycle or election cycle or whatever. We do need to be thinking in much longer term consequences for sustainability. But again, there are more useful and less useful ways of thinking about that long-term narrative.
What finally, so we can let you go after this great, wonderful discussion, and I thank you again for a fantastic presentation, and when folks recover from the seminars we had this week, they're going to check this out on our YouTube channel. What gives you hope? This isn't a question about hope and its impact, but what gives you hope for climate action, knowing the kind of research that you do? Thanks.
I tend to be hopeful about a longer term perspective, more so than specifically thinking about sustainability in terms of what we're doing right now. Okay, it can be so demotivating to think about what might happen, like if our society collapses or whatever. But I'm actually hopeful for thinking about what if the really detrimental parts crumble away and we rebuild something better. So it sounds very negative if you focus only on the crumbling part, but I think we do need some fairly significant changes to our economic system to go in a better direction. But I do see pockets of resilient communities developing in things like contemporary heathenry, in the resurgence of Indigenous revitalization movements, in different religious communities. Like there's so many pro-environmental groups in religious communities. There's lots of good work being done all over the place. So even if our current society doesn't survive in the form that it is in right now, there are things that can overgrow this system and hopefully build something better.
Thank you so much. With that, I thank you again for your time today, your fantastic presentation, and your willingness to sit around and answer some questions from us. So please join me in thanking our speaker today, Dr. Barbara Jane Davy, and I wish you a happy Halloween.
Thanks so much for inviting me to participate.
My pleasure.